SIG-23, it is 11 February 2020, and this particular one is 2 in focuses and 1 snapshot. So the first one, in focus, soft power and hard power. This is from Fort Observer. Reading an article in the socialist magazine Jacobin yesterday, they noticed that the author wrote of the far right. If you're a socialist, far rights share none of your political goals and viciously oppose every ideal you take seriously. They also want you dead. That's as good a definition of a political enemy as I can imagine. End quote. It was interesting to the writer because this is exactly the same thing the far right says about socialists and communists. They want you dead. Much of the gun rhetoric on the far left, especially among those in the burgeoning gun culture, centers on firearms as necessary tools to fight the rise of fascism and the forces of fascism, i.e. law enforcement. While they've observed armed leftist groups grow exponentially over the past 4 years, the far left has also focused on non-armed methods to combat the far right. As the Jacobin author writes, we must also defeat this depraved movement, the far right, through organizing, persuasion, social pressure, and, when needed, force, including law enforcement. Except for the force part, this is what we call soft power, influence and persuasion and appealing to moral authority, as opposed to hard power, which is primarily armed at coercion and violence. Exercising control over national institutions such as education, media, pop culture, and the federal government and its agencies, etc., is the center of gravity for this exercise of the left's soft power. This has largely precluded any need for violence to combat the far right, whose members are routinely deplatformed from social media and who have sometimes had their commercial efforts impeded. This is why athletes, musicians, and other pop culture figures are applauded for joining the social justice movement. This has always been an effort to saturate social justice messaging into the mainstream to achieve moral authority and the moral high ground and to activate those who sit outside the political and social spheres of influence. The most important thing to understand about soft power is that it's a great enabler of hard power. In the information environment of today, it's very difficult to sustain the use of hard power without substantial soft power. But the reverse of this balance is almost always true. Soft power is the ability to frame information through a popular narrative, which absolutely supports armed violence if the message can achieve the moral high ground and garner support for armed violence. One reason why Floyd's rebellion was allowed to continue is because of soft power messaging that justified violence and property damage against law enforcement. In the summer of 2020, how many times were we told that a riot is the language of the unheard? This is a lesson the far right is learning the hard way. While they focus on preparing for violence, they exercise very little soft power and have next to no ability to spread their message in the mainstream. This is why the far right, as of right now, is doomed to the use of hard power to achieve its goals. And this is why there's such a focus on the left on defeating online forums and alternative social media platforms like Gab, which generally allows these groups to get their message out. Anti-fascists inherently understand the implications of soft power. In an email to local media outlets this weekend, Portland area anti-fascists warned that far-right groups would pursue guerrilla tactics due to declining political presence and diminishing influence or a lack of soft power. Ultimately, elements of both the far left and far right could want each other dead. Some assuredly do. A survey of soft and hard power likely dictates how they'll achieve these end goals. Unless the far right can get some form of political representation and increase their soft power, violence is the way forward. Guerrillas often use well-publicized violence as a recruiting tool, which is why we've seen some mass shooters sharing ideological manifestos which get picked up and spread by mainstream media. For the far left, social pressure, the politics of exclusion, and federal law enforcement action is primarily how they'll pursue their goals. Political power is not just about achieving policy goals, but using the levers of government to defeat political enemies. Next in focus, Gray Zone describes the U.S. today. This particular observer was reading a book on gray zone warfare, which is a set of actions taken by a nation state to press conflict without starting an actual shooting war. Like our own low-intensity conflict, these activities fall below the threshold of conventional war but remain well above peaceful, routine competition. In one part, the book outlines some CIA gray zone activities taken against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In addition to supporting the liberal intellectual class in the Soviet Union, CIA shopped books and films like Dr. Zhivago to Soviet outlets, which would distribute these often unknowingly subversive materials. Pasternak writes in Dr. Zhivago, "Revolutions are made by fanatical men of action with one-track mind. They overturn the old order in a few hours or days. The whole upheaval takes a few weeks or at most years, but the fanatical spirit that inspired the upheavals is worshipped for decades thereafter, for centuries." This is a great example of the kind of subversive media the agency seeded into the Soviet Union in order to foment revolution and topple the Soviet regime. This was gray zone warfare. Now, bear with me for a moment. French President Emmanuel Macron and other French intellectuals are renewing complaints about the dangerous ideas emanating from U.S. college campuses, specifically warning of ideological excesses that lead to the ethnicization of the social question in quotations. These ideas on race, gender, post-colonialism, multiculturalism, and forced diversity, what Macron described in October 2020 as certain social science theories entirely imported from the US, are undermining French society, according to Macron and others. Macron fails to mention the fact that Foucault and Derrida, two of the most prominent postmodernists, were both French. Macron went so far as to warn that these ideas are breaking the French Republic in two. France's education minister last year remarked, there's a battle to wage against the intellectual matrix from American universities. French professor François Cousset summarized what's happening. It's the sign of a small, frightened republic declining, provincializing, and which thus seeks those responsible for its decline. This sounds oddly similar to gray zone activities that undermined Soviet society during the Cold War and which are now being propagated against Western civilization. The domestic information environment is made even more complex due to foreign involvement in politics and manipulation of public opinion through information operations. The United States today is, virtually by definition, a gray zone of subversive ideas and armed belligerent groups. Political pundits and casual observers have warned that another civil war is coming. They're wrong. As far as that observer has been writing since 2018, it's already started. We're in the early stage of a low-intensity conflict, and regardless of the final form it takes, it's likely to be waged well into this decade. Lastly, a snapshot. The left's burgeoning gun culture. Armed leftist groups experienced significant growth in 2020. The Socialist Rifle Association more than tripled in size to 10,000 members across 72 chapters by December of 2020. Multiple John Brown gun clubs, leftist community defense groups, and other armed leftist confederations such as the Coalition of Armed Labor, or COAL, and the West Coast Community Defense, or WCCD, were organized and more visible at public events as well. The exact size of these groups are known through human sources or estimated from heavily scrubbed social media posts that protect member privacy. The qualitative improvement of armed leftist groups, however, has been a more readily observable development. Over the last few years, armed leftist groups have experienced a significant improvement in terms of the quality of their firearms, associated tactical gear, and skills training. Most armed leftist groups from 2016 to 2018 largely had military surplus firearms symbolic of the Soviet Union. Bolt-action Mosin Nagant rifles, SKS pattern semi-automatic rifles, older Komblock semi-automatic pistols, and Nagant M1895 revolvers dominated range day posts of these groups. While still deadly and capable weapons, these platforms are largely obsolescent due to limited logistical support and lack of firepower compared to more modern firearms. Some AKM pattern semi-automatic rifles were observed, but most were in stock condition and lacked anything beyond iron sights. The aid of firearms guides, informational videos, and detailed chat room or forum discussions spurred an increase in firearm quality from 2019 and 2020. We observed a significant increase in AR-15 semi-automatic rifles, modern semi-automatic handguns, and various modernized AKM pattern semi-automatic rifles at range events. More members are acquiring and becoming familiar with accessories such as electro-optics and weapon-mounted lights. Many armed leftists greatly expanded efforts to acquire body armor and other tactical gear over the past few years as well. Some group members purchased load-bearing gear, ballistic armor vests, ballistic armor plate inserts, modern retention holsters, and other gear to enhance their capabilities. As more leftists sought out this type of gear and grew weary of doing business with traditionally conservative firearm retailers, they began to call for leftist-friendly product support. Leftists began distributing surplus ballistic gear and manufacturing load-bearing gear and plate carriers. Some groups are becoming more independent with regard to training and current and future members. Multiple SRA and other armed leftist group members became certified instructors for firearm safety, weapons handling, and various concealed carry permit or licensing programs. Most armed leftist groups engage in active recruitment of military members and veterans for their combat or firearms experience. These efforts not only increase their capabilities, but also their legitimacy among firearms owners, organizations, and retailers. The recent ammunition shortage that began during the unrest of 2020, as well as state lockdown measures due to COVID, have put a damper on public events with most armed leftist groups. Still, some hold range days with what limited ammunition they have, and largely have focused on introducing new members to firearms at these events. In terms of training, more groups are recruiting military members and veterans, some offering licensing and official training to members and prospective members. Most armed leftist groups west of the Mississippi gather and train predominantly on abundant public lands. In contrast, some groups east of the Mississippi launched efforts to build their own ranges and training facilities. Observers note, armed leftist groups on the whole have undoubtedly increased the quality of their weapons, tactical gear, and access to training. Despite their progress, most are still lacking in several key areas with regards to modern armed conflict, especially when considering the capabilities of the government and armed right-wing groups. They've not observed any material capability on or formal training on low light or nighttime operations, which is a topic often stressed by armed right-wing groups. No armed leftist group appears to have acquired any significant amount of night vision, thermal, or other infrared spectrum force multiplying technology. The significant financial barrier to entry, lack of ranges that allow low light training, and the concentration of the most experienced trainers or end users being on the political right, will likely further delay the far left's adoption of low-light capabilities. The next likely qualitative development among armed leftist groups is increased focus on tactical communications. Leftist groups in 2020 began posting guides and providing recommendations on communications equipment, such as Communications Equipment for Rebels Guide. With the ongoing ammunition shortage and diminished availability of firearms, as well as higher prices persisting this year, armed leftist groups are likely to start acquiring more affordable communication systems. Their capability may be rather rudimentary at first, but can easily develop into over-the-horizon capabilities with ham radios and other communications platforms. That is that, and that is it for tonight, or this morning. It's 1:23. So, with that, 623 out.